Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. His father was highly educated and a devout Christian, both traits that would strongly influence his son, who graduated from Morehouse College at just 19 years old and proceeded to study at a seminary in Chester, where he was ordained as a Christian minister. He then went on to earn a doctorate from Boston University, where he met Coretta Scott, the woman he would marry, and with whom he would raise a beautiful family of 4 children. Dr. King returned to the South, settling in Montgomery, Alabama, where he became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He also became an active member of the NAACP and began to work on civil rights campaigns, including the Montgomery bus boycott, which famously began when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. During the boycott, Dr. King led the Montgomery Improvement Association, an organization that had been created to coordinate nonviolent resistance to Montgomery's oppressive segregation laws. He was an inspiring speaker with ties to the community through his role as a religious leader. Soon, the Montgomery Improvement Association and other civil rights groups met in Atlanta, merging into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and elected King as the new organization's first president. Dr. King's methods were strongly influenced by another resistance leader, an Indian man named Gandhi. Gandhi helped the people of India resist the rule of the British Empire, which had controlled their country since 1858. Gandhi's resistance against British oppression was based on the philosophy of nonviolence. Gandhi made nonviolence sound simple when he said, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." But how does nonviolent resistance really work? Imagine a group of people are peacefully sitting or marching or simply refusing to do as they are told. Eventually, their oppressors will try to force them to comply, often resorting to violence and brutality. If the victims can avoid responding with violence, the news footage will expose a stark injustice. Most normal people who witness such a scene, in which nonviolent demonstrators are brutalized by police, will recognize that something unjust is happening and will side with the victims. Awareness will be raised, and public opinion will begin to support the resistance. Of course, not fighting back when someone is assaulting you is easier said than done. In order to make sure that the movement had a chance, some activists, such as James Lawson, a friend of Dr. King's, ran training workshops where protesters could practice nonviolent methods of protecting each other and remaining calm without retaliating or resorting to violence. This training helped activists prepare for the abuse they would eventually face during nonviolent protests, such as sit-ins. Sit-ins were a common form of nonviolent resistance, especially at restaurants with segregated seating. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, another organization inspired by the nonviolent resistance of Gandhi and Dr. King, practiced these demonstrations by simply sitting at segregated lunch counters and refusing to move. They were harassed and abused, but they stayed strong, and within months, the lunch counters had ended their segregation policies. Meanwhile, Dr. King and the SCLC had turned their attention to Birmingham, Alabama's largest city, organizing more boycotts, protest marches, and peaceful resistance as part of what was called the Birmingham Campaign. Hundreds of arrests were made, and Dr. King himself was taken to the Birmingham jail. While behind bars, King was publicly criticized by a group of local white preachers, asking how he could defend breaking the law. King responded with a famous letter, noting that there is a difference between a just law and an unjust law, and that while it is important to obey just laws, it is just as important to break unjust laws. And in Birmingham, the laws were terribly unjust, and so was the way they were enforced. In that city, Police Chief Eugene Connor allowed peaceful protesters, including school children, to be brutalized during protest marches. And when the events were recorded, the folks at home saw white police beating up innocent children, and they knew they were seeing injustice. They saw dogs attacking peaceful protesters, and they knew they were seeing injustice. They saw high powered fire hoses used on people just for sitting in a place they weren't allowed to sit, and they knew that what they were seeing was an injustice. And they felt compassion for the victims, and they started to ask why those people weren't allowed to sit in those places in the first place. And as the public pressure built, the president responded. In 1963, John F. Kennedy announced that he would push Congress to pass sweeping civil rights legislation. But the victory was met with violence. Within hours of Kennedy's announcement, an NAACP activist named Medgar Evers was shot and killed in front of his own home in Jackson, Mississippi, by a KKK member. His death was a turning point for the movement and led directly to one of the most famous rallies in American history, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. King gave his best-known speech, sharing his dream for the future of the nation. Before the year was over, President Kennedy himself had been assassinated, but his promise to enact new civil rights laws did not die with him. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, proceeded to sign the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which illegalized discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or nationality. It was the first time the United States would offer Black people equal rights under the law, and it was a watershed moment in American history. But the Civil Rights Act did not address the important issue of voting rights. For that, more activism would be needed.